Previously, Frostshear survived Sister Thessaly's first true assault but survived it wounded, and the fortress's own reports began asking a harder question than any battle plan could answer. Not whether the wall could hold, but how much of the person holding it could be spent before there was no one left underneath the miracle at all. Halden defected from the order he'd once helped build, unable to watch his own gentleness twisted into slaughter. Kai learned, slowly and at great cost, how to release his wall as carefully as he built it. And somewhere beside him a cheerful girl named Ren carried a secret she had promised again and again to reveal only when the moment truly demanded it. If this is your first time joining us, I recommend starting from the very beginning of the Cherry universe. The full playlist is linked below. Now let's continue our story. The message that finally broke Frostshear's fragile spring calm did not come from a scout or a messenger or even the watchtowers. It came from the ground itself. Kai felt it before anyone sounded an alarm, a deep wrong tremor passing through the stone beneath his feet as he crossed the training yard at dawn. Not the familiar rhythm of the fortress he'd learned to feel like a heartbeat, but something underneath that rhythm straining. Warren. He didn't need to say more. Warren was already still, eyes distant, listening to something only a century of memory could recognize. The barrier, he said quietly. Not Frostshear's wall. The old one, the one the world will raised after Ethan. It's here, Kai asked. Underneath us. It runs beneath every front line, Warren said. Threaded through the earth like a root system no one built to be visible. I have felt it before twice in my long life, and both times it meant the same thing. He looked north toward the dark valley, where Thessaly's faithful had regrouped, his expression grave in a way Kai had rarely seen. Someone has found a way to strike at the root instead of the branches. Commander Shaw confirmed it. Within the hour, reports flooding in from 3 separate front lines. Simultaneously, the same deep tremor, the same wrongness in the ground, the same instrument, reading no scholar in Frostshear's archive had ever recorded before. Whatever Thessaly intended, she was no longer content to test one fortress at a time. She's attacking the barrier itself, Shaw said, spreading emergency dispatches across the strategy table, with hands that for the first time since Kai had known her were not entirely steady. Not through us, around us. Directly at the foundation the world will laid 100 years ago. Can she actually break it? Mercer asked. Halden, standing at the edge of the room where he'd been permitted to sit in on strategy sessions since his defection, answered before anyone else could. She believes she can, he said. And worse, I believe she's found a way to make the Abyss believe it too. That is the danger. Not her conviction alone. The Abyss has never before had a reason to focus its full ancient attention on one single point. If it believes the barrier can truly be broken here, it will bring everything it has to prove that belief correct. 2 days later, the full scale of what Thessaly had built became clear. Scouts returning from the northern valley reported a structure, unlike anything the Communion had used before, not a shrine, not a gathering hall, but something closer to a machine built from stolen miracle relics and the willing sacrifice of every convert who had ever chosen to disappear rather than keep fighting. Every village Thessaly's faithful had emptied, every soul who had walked quietly into the dark, believing they were choosing rest, had not simply vanished. They had been spent. She's been building this the entire time, Kai said, staring at the scout's sketches, sick with a horror he hadn't expected to feel this deeply. White Hollow, the garrison survivors, all of it. She was never offering mercy. She was gathering fuel. I don't believe she sees it that way, Halden said, his own guilt written plainly across his face. I believe to the very end, she will insist every one of them chose freely and that their choice absolves her of what she built from it. I no longer believe that distinction matters as much as she thinks it does. Warren's hand found Kai's shoulder, steady despite everything. This is what she meant, he said, when she told you the flame would eventually need spending on something. She was never planning to wait for you to decide what that something was. She built her own answer out of everyone who ever believed hers was the kinder ending. Kai looked at the sketches again, at the shape of the machine drawn from a dozen frightened, hurried accounts, and felt something cold and clear settle into place behind his ribs. Not fear exactly, though fear was certainly there. Resolve. Then we stop her, he said. Before she finishes it. The war council that followed lasted long into the night, and every plan discussed carried the same grim arithmetic. Thessaly's machine sat beyond any single fortress's reach, defended by a force large enough that Frostshear alone could not hope to breach it without abandoning the very line it existed to protect. "We can't leave the wall undefended to strike at her," Mercer said. "And we can't defend the wall while she finishes whatever that machine is built to do." "Then we do both," Kai said, and every head in the room turned toward him. "Frostshear holds. The wall stays defended exactly as it has all winter, and a smaller force goes north fast quiet before she expects anyone to try." "You're volunteering to lead it," Lucian said. It wasn't a question. His voice carried no surprise, only the particular exhausted resignation of someone who had known this moment was coming since the day the crystal first answered a boy who refused to let anyone disappear. "I have to," Kai said. "My miracle is the only thing in this fortress that might actually be able to counter whatever she's built if it comes to that. I won't ask anyone else to carry that risk in my place." "You won't ask," Lucian said. "You also won't go alone. That was decided a long time ago, and it isn't up for negotiation tonight." Ware nodded. "Once already committed." Ren, quiet in the corner of the room for most of the meeting, finally spoke, her usual cheerfulness entirely absent, replaced by something steady and certain that made Kai look at her twice. "I'm coming too," she said. "That was never actually a question, Kai. I told you the day would come when you'd need to understand why I've stayed this close this long. I think that day is finally close enough to see." Kai studied her for a long moment, something in her tone finally too heavy to set aside as simply another delayed mystery. But the council pressed forward before he could ask the question directly, and the moment passed tucked away alongside every other unanswered thing he'd promised himself. He'd return to once the immediate danger allowed. It would not allow it for very much longer. The night before the strike force departed, Kai found himself unable to sleep and left their shared quarters quietly enough that he thought for a moment he'd managed not to wake Lucian. He hadn't. "You're not doing this alone," Lucian said from the doorway, arms crossed expression, carrying none of its usual composure. "I already told you that once tonight. I'm telling you again in case some part of you was hoping I'd change my mind by morning." "I wasn't hoping that," Kai said honestly. "I was hoping I'd find the courage to actually say goodbye to my mother properly," in case he stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Lucian crossed the room and pulled him into an embrace fierce enough to still the tremor that had been building in Kai's hands since the war council ended. "Then we'll write to her together," he said. "Tonight. Not a goodbye. A promise instead. That's the only kind of letter I'm willing to help you write before this." They wrote it together at the small desk by the window, trading the pen back and forth, and it took most of an hour and said nothing at all about wounds or sacrifice or fear, only that Kai was loved thoroughly and without condition by more people than he'd ever quite let himself believe, and that, whatever came next, that love had already made the entire war worth having survived this far. Ren found them still awake near midnight, carrying a small parcel of pastries stolen as always from the kitchens after hours, and settled on the end of the bed without asking the way she always did. "I wanted one more ordinary evening," she said when Kai raised an eyebrow at the hour. "Before tomorrow makes everything complicated." "Are you all right?" Kai asked, some instinct in him sharpened by weeks of watching her carefully guarded weight, refusing to let the question go unasked this time. Ren looked at him a long moment, something achingly fond and achingly sad both moving behind her eyes. "I will be," she said finally. "I promise you that much is true, even if I still can't promise you the rest of it yet." She held out the pastry bag. "Eat something. Whatever tomorrow asks of any of us, it shouldn't be allowed to take tonight along with it." They ate in comfortable, exhausted silence. Three friends who had grown into something more complicated and more precious than any of them had expected. The day a crystal refused to answer a boy who smiled anyway, and none of them said aloud what all three of them were quietly thinking, that whatever tomorrow held tonight, at least they still had each other whole and unspent one final time. Halden joined the departing column at dawn, insisting on a place among them, despite Mercer's initial refusal. "I helped build the despair she's using as fuel," he told the captain, quiet and unwavering. "I will not stay behind while someone else pays for that debt in my place." "You're not a soldier," Mercer said. "No," Halden agreed. "But I know her. I know the shape of the argument she'll make when she finally has to look at what she's built. Someone needs to be there who can recognize the lie the moment she starts believing it again." He met the captain's eyes steadily. Let me be useful in the only way I still know how. Mercer studied him a long moment, then nodded once and said nothing further about it. The column moved fast through terrain the communion no longer controlled as completely as it once had, and Kai spent much of the 2-day march in quiet conversation with Warren, the old heroic spirit sharing for the first time fragments of memory that had begun slowly to surface since his own name's return. I remember a valley like this one, Warren admitted on the second night, staring into their small fire, before the Continental Wall, before any of it. I remember believing the way you believe now, that if I simply gave enough, the giving would eventually stop mattering more than the people I gave it for. He looked at Kai, old grief and old love tangled together behind his calm expression. I was wrong about that in the end. The giving mattered enormously. It simply also cost more than I understood it would until it was already spent. Do you regret it? Kai asked. Becoming what you became. Warren considered the question with the same seriousness he gave everything. No, he said finally. I regret only that I did not understand at the time how much of myself I was still allowed to keep even while giving everything else away. He rested a hand on Kai's shoulder, warm despite a century of not needing warmth at all. Whatever tomorrow asks of you, promise me you'll remember that distinction better than I did. Giving everything you have is not the same as giving away the person doing the giving. Kai nodded slowly, filing the words away alongside every other lesson he'd carried since the day the crystal first answered, unable yet to fully know how soon he would need every single one of them at once. The strike force left Frostshear 3 nights later, Kai, Lucian, Wren, Warren, Halden, and a dozen of Mercer's most seasoned knights moving fast and quiet through terrain the communion no longer controlled as completely as it once had. They found the valley on the second night, lit from within by a sickly pulsing light that had nothing natural about it. Thessaly's machine rising from the frozen ground like something grown rather than built, stone and stolen miracle. Relics fused together around a widening crack in the earth. That, Kai's own senses recognized with a lurch of pure dread, as the same wound he'd felt beneath Frostshear's training yard days earlier. The approach itself cost them dearly before they ever reached the machine's outer perimeter. Ash-robed sentries, fewer in number than the force that had assaulted Frostshear, but far more desperate, fought with the particular ferocity of people who no longer believed there was anything left to lose by dying here. 2 of Mercer's knights fell in the first skirmish alone, and Halden, moving among the fallen sentries afterward, recognized more than one face from villages his own gentler recruitment had once touched. She stopped waiting for volunteers entirely, he said, kneeling beside a boy no older than 16, ash-robed and lifeless in the snow. These aren't converts anymore. These are people she's convinced there's no meaningful difference left between fighting and simply being spent. Kai said nothing, but something in his chest tightened at the sight, one more weight added to everything he was already carrying toward whatever waited at the machine's center. Thessaly stood at its center alone, waiting as though she had known precisely when they would arrive. You came faster than I expected, she said. I confess I'm almost disappointed. I had hoped for a slightly longer conversation before this became necessary. Stop this, Kai said. Whatever it's meant to do, stop it before it finishes. I can't, Thessaly said, and for the first time, something in her calm cracked, just slightly revealing exhaustion underneath it that looked almost human. It no longer requires my permission to finish. I built it to require only enough despair gathered in one place to convince the abyss that this particular wound is worth pouring itself entirely through. She looked toward the widening crack with something that might have been regret, or might simply have been the ghost of an old conviction she no longer fully believed herself. I wanted an ending. I still do. I have simply run out of ways to control which ending arrives. The ground shuddered harder this time, and the crack widened further and far beyond it. In the deep dark, the light could not fully reach something vast, began for the first time to stir. You still believe there's a version of this where you're the one who chose kindness? Kai said, unable to keep the grief entirely out of his voice, looking past her toward the wreckage of ash-robed sentries who had died. Believing her. Look at them, Thessaly. Look at what your mercy actually asked of them in the end. For the first time, something in her composure genuinely faltered. They chose to give everything they had left for an ending they believed in, she said, though the conviction in her voice had thinned to something brittle. I never lied to a single one of them about what that giving would cost. You didn't have to lie, Halden said, stepping forward despite the danger. You only had to let them believe giving everything was the same thing as choosing something. It never was. I spent 3 years making the same mistake, and I promise you the grief of realizing it doesn't arrive gently no matter how carefully you prepare for it. Thessaly looked at him for a long moment, something raw and unguarded, passing behind her eyes quickly buried again beneath the composure she'd worn for years. It's too late for grief now, she said. Whatever this becomes in the next few minutes, it will not wait for any of us to finish deciding how we feel about it. She stepped back from the widening crack, and for the first time, something that looked almost like fear crossed her face. I hope for all our sakes that whatever you intend to do about it, Kai Whitlock, you intend to do quickly. Kai Warren said, urgent now. Whatever this becomes, it will not wait for a battle plan. We need to move. The first creatures poured through within minutes, not the scattered probing shapes of an ordinary assault, but something denser, more desperate, as though the abyss itself understood this wound. Might close again if it did not commit. Everything at once. Mercer's knights formed a line without needing to be told. Veterans and younger soldiers alike falling into the same disciplined rhythm that had carried them through an entire winter, of worse odds than this one should have been. Lucien fought at Kai's shoulder, the way he always had, each of them anticipating the other's next movement without needing to speak it. Aloud, 12 years of shared drills distilled into something closer to a single fighter split. Across two bodies, when a creature nearly twice Lucien's height broke through the front line, Kai's wall answered instantly, stone rising, to buy the half-second Lucien needed to finish the strike. And neither of them paused long enough to acknowledge how naturally the coordination had become. Left flank, Mercer's voice cut through the chaos and half the column pivoted, as one meeting a fresh surge before it could split their formation, and for a while, brief, fragile, hard one, it seemed almost possible that discipline alone might hold the line. Then the crack widened again, faster this time, and something came through it that was not merely another creature. It moved like a shadow given weight, formless and yet somehow deliberate, and where it passed, the ground itself seemed to forget what solid meant. Two of Mercer's veterans fell back from it without shame, weapons raised uselessly against something no blade seemed able to properly touch. That's not the abyss testing us anymore, Halden said, voice tight, pulling a wounded soldier clear of its path. That's the abyss deciding we're finally worth its full attention. Warren met the shadow thing directly, blade, flashing gold, even without a proper contract's full strength behind it, buying precious seconds. Through sheer refusal to yield ground he had once a century ago refused to yield in a different valley entirely. Kai, he called, breathless in a way Kai had never heard from him before. However large you think this needs to be, it needs to be larger. Kai poured more of himself into the wall and felt for the first time real fear alongside the effort, not fear of the creatures, but fear of the widening gap between what the moment demanded and what a single miracle, however grown, however hard-won across 7 years of patient training, could actually provide. The crack widened a third time, and a fourth. Each time Kai's wall answered a little slower, a little less completely, silver light fracturing further up his arms with every renewed effort, and somewhere beneath the desperate clash of steel and stone, he understood with the same cold clarity that had once told him a wall might fail, that, whatever this valley was asking of him, it was going to ask for everything, and there would be no version of tonight where he got to hold anything back. Mercer fought at the center of the line blade, moving with the economy of a man who had spent 23 years learning exactly how much motion a kill actually required, and even he began for the first time since Kai had known him to show the particular strain of a battle that refused to end. On schedule. Beside him, one of the younger knights fell, then rose again on legs that shouldn't have still worked. Dragged upright by a comrade who refused to let the line thin by even one more body than it already had. How much longer can you hold? Lucien asked, breathless, blocking a strike meant for Kai's unguarded side without breaking stride. I don't know, Kai admitted. I've never held anything this large before. Then hold it anyway, Lucien said, fierce and certain. However long anyway turns out to be. We're fighting a step ahead of them. Both met the shadow thing a second time, and this time it very nearly claimed him, a blow that would have ended an ordinary soldier passing instead through armor that no longer belonged fully to this world, leaving him staggered but whole. That will not happen a third time, he said, grimly resetting his stance. Whatever it costs. The crack widened once more, and this time something vast finally began to press through it in earnest, not merely creatures now, but the leading edge of the darkness itself. ancient and patient and utterly without mercy, testing the width of place. The wound the way water tests a crumbling dam. Kai felt the moment arrive the way he'd once felt a training wall's final crack 7 years and a lifetime ago. Not a decision so much as a certainty finally catching up to him, though he said nothing of it. The battle that followed was unlike anything Frostcheer's veterans had prepared any of them for, not the disciplined, holdable chaos of an ordinary abyss assault, but something closer to the earth itself, tearing monsters pouring through, a wound that widened with every passing minute, regardless of how many fell before it. Kai's wall answered as fully as it ever had, spreading, not merely across a defensive line now, but around the widening crack itself, buying seconds, then minutes against a tide that did not appear to have any end at all. It was not enough. He felt it the way he'd felt the tremor days earlier, a certainty rising past argument, past hope, that no wall built from stone and stolen minutes could hold a wound this size closed forever. Lucien fought beside him without faltering. Warren gave everything a century-old heroic spirit had left to give. Halden, weaponless, worked desperately alongside Mercer's knights to pull wounded soldiers clear of the widening crack's edge. And still, the dark poured through. And still, the ground gave way inch by inch, no matter how completely Kai spent himself trying to hold it closed. Thessaly, somewhere in the chaos, had gone silent. Whatever remained of her conviction, finally fully broken by the sight of what her certainty had built. Kai understood, kneeling in the frozen mud with silver light burning through every inch of exposed skin, now fractures spreading faster than he could contain them, that the wall alone would never be enough. That something larger was going to be required. That the war had finally truly arrived at the question every letter from Noah, every lesson from Warren, every quiet warning from Halden had been trying to prepare him for. Not whether he could build something strong enough, whether he was willing to become it completely. Kai! Lucien's voice cut through the chaos, hoarse with effort and fear, both finding him amid the battle with the same unerring instinct that had found him across every crisis since they were children. Whatever you're thinking right now, don't. Not without telling me first. Kai looked at him and for one suspended terrible moment, felt the full weight of everything he was about to choose settle onto his shoulders alongside everything he was about to lose. I don't think I can hold this any other way, he said. Not a wall this time. Not even a fortress. The whole line, I think it needs someone to become the whole line, or it doesn't hold at all. Then I become it with you, Lucien said immediately, fiercely, already moving to stand beside him rather than pull him back. You don't get to decide. This is a debt only you're allowed to pay. I know, Kai said, and something in his chest ached fiercely at the love in that refusal at 7 years and a lifetime of a boy who had never once let him carry anything entirely alone. I'm not choosing this because I think I'm worth more than everyone standing behind me. I'm choosing it because I refuse to let this be the wound where the asking finally stops. I promised a little girl once that I don't want to be the reason someone calls for help and no one answers. His voice broke just slightly on the last words. This is that call. I have to be the one who answers it. Not because I'm a hero, because I never learned how to be anything else. He kissed Lucien once, quick and fierce and entirely unwilling to be anything less than certain, and turned toward the widening crack, both hands rising, silver light gathering not around him now but through him, the full weight of everything his miracle had ever been building toward, finally, terribly arriving. It was in that exact moment, as Kai poured everything he had left toward a wound too vast for any single life to close, that Ren finally stopped being simply Ren. The light that spread from her was not silver. It was gold, warm and impossibly ancient, and it did not announce itself with thunder or triumph, only with a quiet, terrible tenderness that made every soldier still standing turn toward her despite the chaos, unable to look away. I'm sorry, she said, and her voice, though still recognizably hers, carried now something vast underneath it. Something that had watched more worlds end and begin than any single mind should have been able to hold. I promised myself I would wait until the very last possible moment, because I did not want you to spend your whole friendship with me, wondering whether I only stayed close because of what I was rather than because I loved every ordinary, stubborn, impossible thing about you exactly as you already were. Ren Kai's voice broke entirely. My name isn't really Ren, she said, gently, wings of pure golden light unfolding slowly behind her, vast and unhurried, as though she had all the time in the world, despite the earth tearing open only steps away. But it's the truest name I've worn in a very long time, and I think of all the names I've ever answered to, it might be the one I'm proudest of." She looked at him, and something in her ancient, impossible eyes was still entirely the same friend who had teased Lucien over stolen bread and hummed half-remembered lullabies on the ride home from grief. "Every world the abyss reaches gets a messenger, Kai. Most worlds never learn that. Most messengers never have to choose whether the world they're watching is worth everything they have left to give." She smiled at him, warm and sad and entirely certain. "I decided a very long time ago, longer than you'd believe, watching a boy give up his seat on a merchant cart without once looking around to see if anyone noticed that this one was." "What are you saying?" Kai asked, though some part of him had already begun with dawning horror and dawning hope both to understand. "I'm saying you were never going to be able to close this alone," Ren said. "Not with only your own strength. But you were never actually alone, Kai. You've simply been waiting this entire time for the last piece of help you didn't know you already had." Golden light poured from her now in earnest, vast and warm and utterly without fear, pouring not away from Kai but directly into him, into the silver light already burning through every inch of his straining miracle. "Take it. All of it. Finish what you started. Save every single person who's ever reached out a hand asking for help. I've watched you try to answer that call since you were 10 years old, and I refuse to let this be the one time you're finally strong enough to succeed. And still somehow alone in doing it." "Ren, no." Kai's voice cracked, entirely understanding now fully exactly what her light leaving her meant. "Yes," she said, gently, golden and fading, and entirely at peace. "This is my choice, Kai. Just like yours is yours. Let me have it." Gold and silver light met and merged, and for one impossible suspended heartbeat, the entire valley held its breath. The abyss, the dying machine, the exhausted soldiers, even the widening wound in the earth itself, as something neither wholly human nor wholly divine, finally completely closed the door the war had spent an entire winter trying to force open. The light did not fade so much as settle, sinking into the earth and into the crack it had come to close, and for a long moment afterward, no one on that ruined battlefield moved at all, as though moving might undo whatever had just been accomplished at a cost none of them yet had words for. Lucien reached Kai first, catching him before his knees fully gave way, and for one terrible heartbeat, Kai's eyes would not focus. Silver light, still fading slowly from beneath skin, gone nearly translucent with everything he'd just spent. "Kai." Lucien's voice cracked, entirely, all composure abandoned. "Kai, look at me. I'm here," Kai managed, though the words came slow, exhausted, past anything he'd ever felt before. "I'm still here. I promise." His eyes found the place where Ren had stood only moments earlier, empty now, except for a single, small feather, gold and impossibly soft, resting undisturbed on the scorched ground. "Lucien, Ren, I know," Lucien said, his own voice breaking now, grief and relief tangled together past any ability to separate them. "I saw." Warren knelt beside them, both expression unreadable, one hand reaching to gently lift the small golden feather from the ground, holding it with a reverence that belonged to someone who understood exactly what kind of sacrifice it represented, having walked a version of that same road himself a century earlier. "She kept her promise," he said. "She waited until the very last moment. And then she gave you everything she had left so that you would never have to learn what it costs to close a wound like that entirely alone." The crack in the earth, Kai realized slowly, was gone. Not merely sealed. Healed, the ground smooth and undisturbed where moments earlier the abyss had been pouring through in a tide no ordinary wall could have held closed. Thessaly's machine lay in ruins around them, its stolen light finally, mercifully extinguished. And Thessaly herself sat motionless amid the wreckage, staring at the empty space where the wound had been, an expression on her face that held no triumph at all, only a grief too large to hold, watching at last the true shape of everything her certainty had cost. Halden knelt beside her without hesitation, offering no argument, no accusation, only a hand extended the same way he had once extended tea to grieving mothers who needed more than anything to simply not be alone in the wreckage of their own worst decisions. "It's over," he said. "Whatever you believed you were building toward, it's over now." Thessaly looked at his offered hand for a long moment and did not take it, but did not turn away from it either, And something in that small, uncertain hesitation suggested perhaps for the first time since her order had first splintered the baited ins. Beginning of a question she had not yet allowed herself to ask. Far above the ruined valley where no ordinary eye could see, the sky had begun faintly, impossibly to change color, not dawn. Though dawn was still hours away, but something gentler, something gold threaded quietly through the retreating dark, though the world itself had noticed for the first time in a very long war that someone had finally been willing to give everything they had left to prove it was worth saving. Kai, barely conscious in Lucien's arms, looked up at that strange, gentle light one last time before exhaustion finally claimed him entirely, and thought, with the last clear thought, he could manage that wherever Ren had gone, he hoped, more than he had ever hoped for anything, that some part of her had known in that final golden heartbeat exactly how loved she had always been, not because of what she was, because of every ordinary, stubborn, impossible thing she had chosen to become long before any of them had understood what it had cost her to keep choosing it. Mercer found them an hour later, having spent the intervening time organizing the survivors, tending the wounded, and confirming with grim efficiency exactly how many of his knights would not be making the journey home. He knelt beside Kai's unconscious form for a long moment before speaking, and when he did, his voice carried none of its usual gruffness. "I've buried good soldiers on worse ground than this," he said to no one in particular. "I never once buried a miracle." He looked toward the smooth-heeled earth where the wound had been, then toward the small golden feather, wherein still held with careful reverence. "I don't have the first idea what to write in my report about tonight. I'm not certain the ordinary language of war has room left for whatever just happened here." "Write the truth," Halden said, still kneeling near Thessaly, who had not yet spoken again nor moved from the wreckage of everything she'd built. That a boy who never once thought of himself as a hero gave everything he had to answer one final call for help. That someone who had watched over him since, before either of them understood what she truly was, decided in the end that he was worth becoming mortal to save. He looked up at the strange, gentle light still touching the eastern sky. "I don't think the language for that exists yet. Perhaps it doesn't need to. Perhaps some things are simply meant to be carried, rather than written down." Lucien said nothing at all, sitting perfectly still with Kai cradled against him, one hand pressed flat over the faint, steady heartbeat still beating beneath Kai's ruined coat, refusing to let himself believe anything except that the heartbeat itself was proof enough for now. The wounded were gathered. The dead were carried with the same careful reverence Frostcheer had learned to offer every fallen name across an entire hard winter. And as the strike force began slowly, exhaustedly, the long march back toward the fortress they had left 3 nights earlier, the strange golden light in the eastern sky did not fade. If anything, as the hours passed, it seemed to grow steadier, as though something far beyond the frozen valley had finally fully turned its attention toward the small, stubborn world that had just proven at tremendous cost exactly what it still believed was worth saving. Warren walked beside the litter carrying Kai for the entire journey home, saying little, the small golden feather tucked carefully inside his coat, and only once in the deep hours before dawn did he speak the thought that had been sitting heavy and unresolved in his chest since the light first merged over the healed wound. "I do not know yet what tomorrow asks of any of us," he said, quiet enough that only Lucien walking beside him could hear. "But I know this much. Whatever comes next, it will not look like the war we've been fighting all winter." He looked toward the horizon where the strange gold light continued patiently to grow. "I believe for the first time in a very long life that something is finally about to answer back." Kai drifted in and out of consciousness during the long march home, the world arriving to him in fragments, the sway of the litter, Lucien's voice murmuring something. He couldn't quite catch the cold, clean smell of the thawing air. In one of those brief surfacings somewhere past midnight, he found Lucien's hand still wrapped tightly around his own, and managed with effort that felt disproportionate to the size of the words to speak. "Is she really gone?" Lucien's grip tightened. "I don't know," he admitted, voice rough with exhaustion and grief both. "I don't think any of us know yet what gone even means for something like her. Warren's carrying the feather like it might still matter. I choose to believe that means something." "I should have asked more questions," Kai murmured, "about what she was. I let her keep the secret because I didn't want to push a door she wasn't ready to open." "You gave her exactly what she asked for," Lucien said gently. the chance to choose when the telling happened instead of having it taken from her. I don't think that was a mistake, Kai. I think it might have been the last kindest thing you could have offered her without even knowing that's what you were doing. Kai's eyes slipped closed again, but not before he managed one more thought, barely more than a breath. I want to believe I'll see her again someday, even if it's not soon. Then believe it, Lucien said. I intend to. Far south, within Avalon's quiet halls, Noah Bennett woke abruptly in the deep hours before dawn, a certainty settling over him that he could not immediately explain sharp enough that Cale stirred beside him at the sudden tension in his shoulders. What is it? Cale asked, voice thick with sleep. I don't know, Noah admitted, sitting up, eyes fixed on the window where Avalon's eternal light shimmered against the dark. Something changed. Somewhere far from here. I felt it the way I once felt Ethan's wall answer for the very first time 100 years ago. He pressed a hand to his chest to a heartbeat that had carried this same particular ache only a handful of times across an entire century of living. Something enormous just happened. And I think, whatever it cost, it was not entirely a loss. Kyle sat up beside him, taking his hand without needing to be asked, the same steady, wordless comfort he had offered for 100 years now through every ending and every beginning both. Then we'll find out what it means, he said, the same way we found out everything else. Together and in the morning, and not one moment before we absolutely have to. Noah allowed himself finally a small, tired smile and let Kyle's steady presence ease some of the ache in his chest, though the certainty that something vast had shifted in the world remained with him long after sleep finally reclaimed them both. Frostshear's gates opened to receive the returning strike force 2 days later, and the fortress that met them was not the same one they'd left. Word had somehow traveled ahead of them the way it always did on the frontier, not the full truth which none of them yet had words to properly tell, but enough of it. Enough that soldiers lined the walls in silence as the column passed through the gate, enough that Commander Shaw herself stood waiting at the threshold, rather than in her usual strategy room. Enough that the old farmer Kai had once helped mend a fence for stood among the gathered crowd. One hand pressed to his chest, watching the litter pass with tears already streaming down his weathered face. Kai, conscious now, though still weak, silver fractures fading slowly from beneath his skin with every hour of rest, looked out at the gathered faces and felt something complicated settle in his chest, not pride exactly, and not simple relief, but something closer to the quiet, humbling weight of being seen clearly at last by people who finally understood what the winter had actually cost him to survive. Halden walked beside Thessaly's litter. She had come willingly in the end, offering no resistance, her composure entirely spent, and found himself met at the gate, not with the hostility he'd braced for on her behalf, but with the same careful, uncertain mercy Frostshear had learned to offer its own wounded across an entire hard season. She'll answer for what she's done, Commander Shaw said, meeting Halden's eyes. But she'll answer for it here among people who understand exactly how desperation can curdle into something it never meant to become. That's more mercy than most would offer her. I suspect it's also more than she expected. It's more than she gave herself permission to hope for, Halden said. I think that might be exactly the kind of mercy that finally reaches her where gentleness alone never could. Mercer found Kai as the litter was finally set down inside the infirmary, and said nothing for a long moment, simply resting a hand briefly on his shoulder. The closest thing to open sentiment the captain had ever allowed himself twice in the Trom, same season. Rest, he said finally. That's an order, not a request. Whatever Frostshear needs from you next, it can wait until you've actually slept through a night without a battle demanding otherwise. Kai managed a tired smile. Yes, sir. And Kai. Mercer paused at the door, something almost gentle crossing his scarred, weathered face. Whatever she was, your friend. I've buried a great many soldiers on this frontier. I've never once watched an entire fortress grieve someone, the way this one is grieving her right now, without most of them even knowing her real name. He looked toward the eastern sky, where the strange golden light still lingered, faint but steady against the retreating dark. I think that says something worth remembering about the life she chose to spend here, disguised as an ordinary girl who told terrible jokes and stole bread off everyone's plates. He left before Kai could find an answer worthy of that, and Kai lay back against the infirmary pillow, Lucian's hand still warm around his own, and watched the strange gold light through the frosted window until at last exhausted past anything sleep alone could fully mend. He let his eyes close. and allowed himself for the first time since the valley to simply rest. Whatever tomorrow finally asked of him, of Frostshear, of a world that had just glimpsed for one impossible heartbeat exactly how much an ordinary heart could give, it would still be there in the morning. For tonight, it was enough to have survived long enough to see it arrive. It was Lucien who noticed it first 3 nights later, watching Kai sleep in the pale gray light before dawn. The silver fractures had finally faded entirely from Kai's skin, the way they always did once his miracle settled back to rest. But something remained that had never been there before. A faint warmth, barely visible, gathered just beneath his collarbone, gold rather than silver, so soft it might have been imagined entirely if Lucien hadn't spent every night since their return watching for exactly this kind of change. He didn't wake Kai to ask about it. Some part of him understood without needing to be told that whatever this quiet golden warmth meant, it was still too new, too fragile to be examined before it was ready to be found. Wherein, keeping his own silent watch from the doorway, saw it too, and said nothing either, though something in his ancient weathered face carried both grief and a cautious unspoken hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Outside, the last of the winter's snow finally began in earnest to melt, and somewhere far beyond Frostshear's walls, in a sky that had not fully returned to ordinary darkness since the valley, a single point of gentle golden light continued patiently to watch over the fortress that had finally proven at tremendous cost exactly what an ordinary world was worth saving for. The war was not over, not entirely, but something had shifted deep and fundamental in the shape of what remained to be fought, and Frostshear, wounded and grieving and quietly stubbornly whole, settled into an uneasy spring to wait and see exactly what that shift would finally better. Ask of all of them,